Capua, 73 years before Christ. Beneath the cheering of the Roman crowds, a different kind of arena lived in silence below the sand, behind iron bars, beneath the feet of those who never looked down. When a gladiator won, he was awarded more than gold. He was given flesh, not his own, but a girl. A girl like Elira, dragged from the provinces, too young to fight, too old to be forgotten. Her cage had no lions, only locked doors, stained stone, and a life meant to serve someone else's victory. She did not know his name when they pushed her through the stone gate. The corridor was narrow, the walls damp with old sweat, and the sound of iron clinking echoed from somewhere too far to see. A torch sputtered above her head, casting crooked shadows on the brick. 2 guards walked behind her, neither speaking. The man who had bought her the lanista had explained everything in one sentence. When they win, they get you. Her wrists were raw from rope, but she had learned not to ask for bandages. In Thrace, her name had meant wildflower. Here, no one asked what it meant. The floor grew warmer as they descended, the heat from the forge and the pit below rising like breath from a beast. She was taken past a row of barred cells where men slept on straw mats, their muscles twitching in restless dreams. Some of them looked up when she passed. One whistled. Another muttered a prayer in a language she didn't know. The guards opened a wooden door near the end of the hall. Inside was a room no larger than a merchant's stall, with nothing but a stone bench, a cracked basin of water, and a pile of cloth that passed for bedding. "Stay here," one said. "He'll come after the next fight." The door closed. She listened to the bolt slide into place. Above her, the roar of the crowd rose, sharp and violent. A man's name was shouted over and over. She did not recognize it, but she knew what it meant. Someone was winning. She sat on the bench and placed her hands in her lap. She had no mirror, but she tried to smooth her hair. It was the only gesture of control she had left. When the door opened again, hours later, the torchlight spilled over her bare feet. A shadow moved across the threshold. He was tall, his tunic soaked in blood and sand. His eyes met hers. Unreadable, he stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and said nothing. This was the reward. This was what they called honor. She did not scream. There was no point. Screaming was for people who still thought someone might hear. The arena above her shook like a living creature, every stomp of the crowd sending dust drifting from the beams into her hair. Elira sat on the cold stone floor of the chamber they called the blood room, though no one ever explained the name aloud. It was the place where victors were sent after a match, a place where triumph was not celebrated with wine or rest, but with the presence of another human being who had no choice but to exist beside them. The lanista said it kept the men fierce. The guards said it kept them loyal. The truth lay somewhere between cruelty and convenience, tied into the same Roman logic that governed every breath beneath the amphitheater ceiling. She heard footsteps long before she saw him. They always walked slowly after a victory, as though adjusting to the strange weight of surviving yet again. When the door opened, Tiberius Gracchus stepped inside. She recognized him now, even without the shouts of the crowd announcing his name. He was younger than she expected, his face marked more by exhaustion than age. His hair, dark and matted from the fight, clung to his temples. His tunic was streaked with sand. He carried no weapon, yet the room itself seemed to bend around him as if unsure whether he still needed one. He did not look at her at first. He removed the leather guards from his wrists, placed them carefully on the bench, and washed his hands in the basin with a slow, ritualistic precision. She watched in silence, unsure whether she was meant to speak, unsure whether speaking would anger him or break some unspoken rule. No one ever explained the rules to the women. They were expected to simply understand them. When he finally turned toward her, his gaze was not the hungry sneer she had braced for. It was something far stranger, a mixture of weariness and resignation, as though he hated this room almost as much as she feared it. "They sent you here," he said quietly, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement of a system neither of them controlled. She nodded, her hands tightening in her lap. He sat on the opposite side of the room, his back against the wall, breathing in shallow, deliberate rhythms. The silence stretched between them like a long corridor. Outside, the crowd roared again for a different man, a different match, a different ending. Down here, there was only stillness. The guards had told her earlier that she was a reward, a privilege, a reminder of life after death. But looking at him now, she saw none of that reflected in his eyes. She saw only the strain of someone trapped in a role designed to please others. He exhaled slowly, almost a sigh. "I do not choose these things," he said, the confession barely audible. A single torch flickered above them, casting their shadows together on the uneven stone. For a moment, Elira felt something unexpected pity, not for herself, but for him. Victors were celebrated on the sand, yet down here, in the quiet, they were as powerless as she was. The only difference was that one of them had survived the arena, and the other had survived the choosing. The morning after the games, Elira was taken from her chamber before the torches were even lit. The corridors were still wrapped in darkness, broken only by the soft scrape of sandals and the murmured orders of the guards. She walked with her arms folded tightly across her chest, more out of instinct than warmth. A thin breeze drifted through the underground hallways, carrying the metallic smell that clung to every corner of the ludus. She followed the men without question, though her stomach coiled with dread. In Rome, a summons at dawn rarely meant kindness. The guards led her into the atrium, where the first gray light of day seeped through the open roof. Several female slaves stood in a line, their eyes lowered, their bodies tense. Elira joined them. No one spoke, no one dared. A Roman magistrate had arrived in Capua to inspect the properties of the ludus, and that included the human bodies within it. His presence filled the room long before he stepped inside. When he finally appeared, draped in a crimson-edged toga and flanked by scribes, the guards straightened as though he carried authority carved from stone. He walked slowly down the line, pausing at each woman, examining their hair, their posture, the tone of their skin, the clarity of their hands and feet. Slaves were assets, and assets were expected to meet standards. Elira kept her gaze fixed on the floor, but she felt his eyes slide across her like a cold finger. When he reached her, he lifted her chin with two indifferent knuckles. She forced herself not to flinch. His scribe muttered something about her age, her condition, her potential. Then came the words she feared most. "She is unmarked," the magistrate said. "That will need correction." Elira did not understand at first. The other women had marks hidden beneath their tunics, small symbols burned into their skin to show ownership. She had seen glimpses of them while washing or working, thin lines, letters, and occasionally the crest of the lanista. The branding was not punishment. It was identification, a way to ensure no one could claim they were free. The guards seized her gently but firmly, guiding her toward a small brazier glowing in the corner. A metal rod rested in the embers, its tip already turning a dull, angry red. Her breath caught. She thought of Thrace, of cold rivers and open fields, of a childhood name spoken by a mother whose face she barely remembered. Here, names meant nothing. Property did not need names, only marks. She did not struggle. She knew better. Resistance would only make the moment longer, and the outcome would not change. The guard pressed her shoulder, steadying her. The magistrate nodded for them to continue, already turning away to inspect another woman. Elira closed her eyes. When the iron touched her skin, she did not cry out. The pain was sharp, bright, immediate, then smothered by a ringing silence inside her own head. What hurt more was knowing that the mark would outlive her voice. When the guards finally stepped back, she remained still, her breathing shallow. The scribe recorded her new status on a wax tablet. The magistrate left without a second glance. And as the sun finally rose over Capua, Elira understood the truth. She belonged to the house now, not just in life, but in flesh. The feast began long after dusk, when the arena had been drained of blood and the echoes of the crowd had faded into drunken silence. But beneath the stone tiers, the night was just beginning. Torches flickered in the halls of the ludus, and oil lamps glowed like low suns around the outer ring of the training yard. Elira stood in a corner of the lower chamber, her arms bare, her tunic freshly washed, her skin still sore from the wound on her shoulder. The mark had not yet scarred. It burned beneath the fabric like a silent brand of belonging. She had not been summoned to serve wine. She had been summoned to be seen. The lanista moved through the corridors like a host of a perverse banquet, his voice slick with pleasantries as he led Roman elites through the halls. Senators and merchants with bellies soft from too much luxury trailed behind him, stopping occasionally to admire the muscle of a passing gladiator or the silence of a slave girl. They called it entertainment, but it was closer to inspection livestock viewed before slaughter. Every girl in the room knew the game. Their silence was not fear. It was survival. Tiberius stood apart from the others, arms crossed, still dusted with dried earth from his earlier match. His brow was furrowed as he watched the men pass by. He did not speak, but when his eyes met Elira's, something tightened between them. He had not touched her since that night in the bloodroom, not because he was forbidden, but because he seemed to understand something the others did not, that her presence in his chamber had never been a choice. The lanista clapped his hands. A nobleman leaned forward, slurring from too much wine. "Let the champions choose," he said, loud enough to echo against the stone. "They've earned their pleasures." The women were lined up, Elira among them. Her legs trembled beneath her tunic. Though she stood tall, she had no say in the matter. One by one, the gladiators stepped forward. Some chose quickly, others with a deliberate cruelty, walking the line as if picking out tools. Tiberius moved last. He walked past the others, past the noblemen who watched with eager smiles. When he reached Elira, he stopped. The room quieted. He said nothing, just held her gaze. Then, with a nod to the lanista, he placed a hand on her shoulder. Not a grip, just weight, ownership, masked as mercy. The others laughed, teased him, called it love. But Elira knew better. It was not affection. It was protection. A choice made in a room where choices were currency. As he led her away, her body moved like a shadow behind him, but her mind was already ahead, wondering how long kindness could last in a world that had no word for it. The night it began, the wind outside the walls changed direction. It carried the scent of something burning wood, oil, blood perhaps, but not from the arena. This smoke came from the kitchens, or the armory, or some place too quiet to notice until the flames had already caught. Elira had been scrubbing the floor of the passage near the storage room, her knees raw against the stone. She heard no scream, no signal, only the sudden crash of iron and the sound of feet, many feet rushing in one direction. Then a man shouted in Greek, and something inside her snapped awake. The revolt did not begin with horns or banners. It began with knives taken from butcher stalls and whetstones. It began with whispers traded between slaves over stale bread. It began in silence. Spartacus was just a name until he became a force, until he kicked open the doors of the lower cells and raised his voice loud enough to shatter the stillness the Romans thought they had mastered. Some say he had help from inside. Others say he moved like a god, untouched by blade or flame. But Elira saw him with her own eyes that night. He bled like any other man. She hid behind the jars of salted olives stacked near the rear exit. Her breath came fast, shallow, as men thundered past her with torches and hammers. Some wore scraps of armor. Others were shirtless, streaked with dirt and rage. Tiberius was among them. Not at the front, not barking orders, but moving with purpose. A sword in one hand and the other stretched back to steady the man behind him. He passed so close she could see the old scar beneath his collarbone. The one shaped like a bird or a blade, it was hard to tell in the dark. He saw her, just for a second. His eyes met hers through the haze of smoke and panic. He did not speak, but he turned, stepped back, reached for her. "Elira," he said. Her name, for the first time, spoken like something sacred. She hesitated. Freedom was a word she had never worn. It felt heavy, sharp-edged, unreal. But she took his hand. They did not run toward the gate. That path was already lost to chaos. Instead, he led her through a narrow corridor behind the medicus's quarters, where the stone floor was littered with discarded rags and broken chains. She stumbled once. He caught her, not as a master would catch a prize, but as a man catches a falling memory. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of horses and Roman commands, orders barked by guards who had woken too late. Freedom, if it existed, was only seconds ahead, but so was the end. The gates of Capua would not stay open for long, and for women like her, the hardest chains were not on the wrists, but in the silence that followed escape. The smoke had cleared by morning, but the silence that followed was heavier than fire. Capua did not burn like a city in rebellion. It smoldered like a wound too deep to treat. The main gate had been shattered, its hinges twisted and scorched. Dead guards lay in the courtyard, their armor still warm, their faces frozen in disbelief. But not everyone had fled. Not everyone had been chosen. The revolt had freed the strongest, the fastest, the ones with knives hidden in their bedding. Women like Elira, whose weapons were invisible, had been left behind. She stood among the ruins of the training yard, ash in her hair, the mark on her shoulder raw beneath torn linen. Tiberius had tried to take her with him. He had pulled her through the narrow halls, past the burning storerooms, through the stables where a dozen men had already mounted stolen horses. But the moment they reached the edge of the outer wall, the guards returned, armed, alert, and furious. Arrows rained from the towers. The gate slammed shut behind them with the finality of law, and in that blur of shouting and steel, he had looked at her once, only once before being forced to choose. Run or die. He had whispered her name again, softer this time, like an apology. Then he turned. She never saw him again. By midday, a new lanista arrived, not with ceremony, but with ledgers. His tunic was white, his fingers ink-stained, and his voice carried the chill of Roman order. He walked the perimeter of the ruined ludus with a detachment that chilled Elira more than the fire ever had. The dead were catalogued, the walls repaired, the training schedules redrawn. The women were lined up once again. This time there were fewer of them. Some had escaped, some had not. A new brand was brought out, different in shape but no less hot. The man explained that the property lost must be recouped. There would be auctions, new girls purchased from nearby ports. Nothing would be wasted. Elira said nothing. Her hands were folded, her lips closed. Her silence had become so practiced it was no longer a choice. It was her native tongue now. That night, the torches were lit again. The sounds of sword drills echoed once more through the stone corridors. The beds were filled, the blood room swept clean. She returned to her chamber. It was unchanged, cold, cracked, small, but something inside her was not the same. Beneath the silence, something had shifted. She touched the place on her arm where Tiberius had grabbed her hand, not in violence, not in demand, just held it, as though anchoring her to something beyond this place. Rome would forget her, the lanista would not speak her name, the games would continue, but in the space between screams and silence, she remembered. She was never meant to be remembered, but you remember her now. If you enjoy videos like these, and tell me in the comments which state or country you're watching from, I read every single them all.